Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Chris Vasquez, and I will serve as the lead panelist for today's conversation on navigating the storm, crisis oversight for board directors and executives. One of the things that I'll start with is just crises don't just happen to the executive team of the board, of the company. Really, the board is very engaged in that, and it really tests your clarity of what your organization is doing, and it tests your courage and your preparedness as a board member. With insight from directors and advisors who've been in the thick of real-time crises, we'll explore that work. We'll explore what boards do right, where we kind of stumble a little bit as board members, and talk a little bit about public and private boards. What does real crisis readiness look like in the boardroom, and what are some signs that as board members we miss?
Of course, and I'll actually list what I believe the top 5 or 6 crisis actions might be, or scenarios. And I would categorize these as low probability, but incredibly high impact. So number 1, that you can all relate to watching the news cycle: loss of a leader. The loss of the CEO at United Healthcare, the stock has not recovered, down over 20%. Reputationally, loss of Elon Musk at Tesla. Quarterly report just came out, down 70%. 2, a natural disaster. No one saw Asheville, North Carolina this past year. No one saw the wildfires. This is now consistently 3 to 5 major natural disasters events with the loss of personnel and or infrastructure. 3, terrorism. If you're watching the news cycle 48 hours ago, this is the 9th major terrorist attack in 13 months. 26 tourists were gunned down in India near the border of Pakistan. 4, conflict war zones, whether it's the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, what's happening in Gaza, Israel, or soon to be what potentially could happen in Iran. Conflict war zones, let alone Ukraine and Russia, all of these have enduring factors. And frankly, corporate America was completely taken by surprise when Russia rolled tanks into Ukraine. 5, geopolitics, geoeconomics. As you think about the pressure of supply chain right now, coming out of COVID, slightly kind of regaining the advantage, getting global supply chains up and running again. First major disruption is the closure of the Red Sea because of the Houthis in Yemen, and now the beginning of the tariff negotiation and the tariff war. All of these things are putting material pressure on global company supply chain. To summarize, those low probability, very high impact events are the things that I believe, as described, boards should be thinking about now, why it's calm and quiet, if you will, so that they are not surprised when these major events occur. Some of them are operating in real time. Some of them will occur. It's April. In the next 8 months, with 100% certainty, there will be natural disasters both globally and in the United States. With 100% certainty, there will be more conflict and more war. With 100% conflict, there will be additional geopolitical, geoeconomic surprises. That is the framework, I believe, and the baseline of what boards should be thinking about.
In just building on Dale, who've pointed out there, is a really important factor here is for all boards and executives to actually be aware of what insurance is in place, and actually don't just review these things when it's coming up to renewal cycle, but it's constantly understanding what is insured and then seeing what the emerging sort of risk landscape or threat levels are, and then working with that insurance and finding the gaps in coverage, and then working with a broker to find out what gaps can be filled and creating a full tailor-made insurance policy, but then working with the crisis response element as well to build that into the policy. Now, with the way that the world is going, we're aligning ourselves with underwriters that are also partnered with a crisis responder to ensure that if any of these events ever do happen, that there's that risk mitigation in there as well. And then also the benefit of using that crisis responder to help navigate any of these events that could or hopefully should never unfold. But if they do, then there's the right playbook to be used.
Okay, let's think a little bit as a board member, and a crisis occurs, or we're seeing something coming at our organization. When should the board intervene and or bring in outside counsel?
Well, I would say board members, the saying is we should have our noses in and hands out. Board members, there are a group of situations where board members actively need to play a role. And that is dealing with the board member's one employee, and that's the CEO. So if the crisis is regarding the CEO, in other words, the loss of the CEO, or some type of situation involving the CEO, of which Dale has referred to them, it's in the headlines every day. You've had situations of behavioral issues related to a CEO and a member of his staff. You've had situations of a death of a CEO or a serious illness of a CEO. That is when the board actually does play a role in that crisis. Otherwise, the board needs to serve as an advisor to the CEO and the management team and let them do what they were hired to do. Back to what I said in the beginning, the board needs to make sure that the management team is prepared for a crisis before they have one. So to Dale and Will's point, they need to make sure that the board that the management team has conducted a risk analysis, that they've developed scenario plans and how they will respond, that they've practiced how they will respond, and that they've lined up the necessary outside counsel, advisors, insurance, whatever types of support that they will need in the event of a crisis. They need to make sure all of those ducks are in a row and be prepared. There may be an occasion, one other situation where the board plays an active role. But as Chris and I were discussing before the program started, this is a very unique situation that I don't consider in the normal crisis bucket, but it is a crisis, and that is shareholder activism. That is something that you need to have a completely full-blown plan that is slightly different than your crisis plan, and that is also where a board may be involved, because that usually involves the board in governance. And there are members here in the audience who could speak to this ad infinitum. And but that is another situation, crisis situation, in which the board will play an active role.
Dale or Will?
Yeah, I'll start. Again, I'll play off of what she just stated. And I'm a CEO and I have a board. I will tell you, the last thing I want is a board sticking their nose too deep into something in the middle of a crisis, unless, and this is the big unless, it is my job of the management team as described to manage crisis. If the C-suite or the management team, myself as the CEO, are not moving quickly, we are not clearly prepared, the board can sense it, and the board, at that point, their role is to be asking the hard questions. If I was to give you a checklist, my key criteria for when the board should intervene is when reputational damage is imminent. Number two, when there is real financial risk in the short term and or the long term. Three, operational risk to the firm. And ultimately, the C-suite appears to be stumbling. That is my overall kind of checklist mentality of when the board should intervene. That being said, to make this real, I'll make just a couple of statements. Visa, Palo Alto, Deloitte, they all were warned about the Ukraine. They all had assets and people in the Ukraine. They were warned over and over for 2 months to get ready, and they literally assumed it away and did not believe Russia would row tanks and start a war. I could use that same template about a coup in Turkey, about wildfires in Los Angeles, about the fall of Kabul. And every one of these scenarios, every one of those firms has resiliency books, does tabletops, but yet they were still not fully prepared. So there is a disconnect on when to pull that trigger, and the board's role is to be asking hard questions and do not assume away global politics, global geopolitics, and what can happen next in these regions. And don't fail from a lack of imagination of what can happen will happen. I see this often with boards. Ultimately, they've got to be asking the hard, gritty questions. If the management team is on top of it and has real answers, great. If they don't, or you sense they are not fully prepared, that is your time to inject yourself around reputation, financial, and operational risk.
Let me jump in there, Dale, with something you said. So as a board member, whether it's a public company or a private company, is it appropriate for me to talk to internal or external individuals?
Do you want me to answer that, ma'am?
Go ahead, and then I'll call on Francis.
Okay. So I'll be very, very direct here. Internally, the board should be talking to the C-suite as described. Externally, I do not believe the board should be communicating anything unless the CEO and the management team have failed to properly manage the communication externally to the public and internally to affected employees, family members, things like that. Ultimately, I think the board's role is internal only. It should not be publicly or outwardly facing unless, again, they sense they're going in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Dale. I'll share with you on the board that I serve on, we had an issue, and our CEO was very clear with us as board members that we should not speak directly to the media. Our general counsel was as clear as could be as well. And what we were just instructed to redirect them back to the CEO. The concern there is that as a board member, you might disclose something, especially if you're on a publicly traded board, that gives the company some exposure. And so really support the response that Dale had, which as a board member, I'm just redirecting them right back to the CEO. Now, as a board member, I want to be engaged and educated on the situation, which our CEO did a very good job with that, and our general counsel did as well. But Francis, what would you add onto that?
Well, I'm in violent agreement with both of you. What I would say is the other issue is, first of all, with the media, if they see an opportunity to try and reach a board member and that board member bites, the first thing that they'll start doing is trying to find the weak link and to get someone to say something that they shouldn't be saying. And all of a sudden, the crisis becomes what that individual has said. You may again be publicly disclosing material information that needed to go through another channel. You may be creating a whole nother crisis on top of what the actual crisis was. So, as Dale has already articulated very clearly and very well, board members should not be speaking externally unless there has been a decision within the board and the CEO may perhaps begrudgingly, but that the management team has not performed their duties in communicating, and that the board has basically usurped that position from the management team. But that should be done quite rarely, and in that particular situation, there clearly need to be other consequences after the crisis is over. And I just want to reiterate again what Dale said. Management teams that really fulfill their responsibility in this area do know what they're doing, and particularly companies that recognize these vulnerabilities, whether they are geopolitical, whether they involve, their exposure to incidents, their exposure to violence. I made the comment when we were discussing this that I worked for an energy company, and our CEO would never have been walking. First of all, the location of our investor meeting would have never been disclosed in a press release. It would have never been publicly disclosed. And our CEO would never have been walking the streets of New York unaccompanied. Now, we didn't have armed policemen with him, but believe me, we had high-level security at every event and everywhere our CEO went. It wasn't evident to everyone, but we knew it. And that's not a criticism. Don't take it as such. I'm just making the point that these things are things people need to be concerned about for the very reason that Dale articulated. They have financial implications and operational implications. That was a black swan event for United Healthcare Group and continues to be. So these are the types of vulnerabilities, real vulnerabilities, and they do happen every day. Wiping out half of the city of Los Angeles or more is a real vulnerability in this day and age.
Thank you. Let's jump into insurance and legal exposure as well as third-party risk. Will, I'll start with you. What should boards know about their insurance, D&O, cyber, before a crisis hits?
Yeah, I think understanding exactly what your insurance is there to provide and understanding exactly the risk transfer programs that are in place is highly important. But then the more important point is actually understanding where the potential gaps are and where then the potential implications to the people element, the property element, and then potentially the company's revenue, and where those, if an event happens, where the losses could come from, and then also working out how best to mitigate that going forward. So I mentioned earlier that insurance policies and the insurance market is constantly evolving and changing. And part of that, there needs to be a constant review of these insurance policies and making sure that the cover in place is the right cover, and actually looking at the correct limits or deductible levels. So if there is a potential supply chain issue, your loss may not be directly impact to your company, but then actually it might be more of a contingent loss where you can't get a semiconductor from Taiwan, for example, because of issues in the South China Sea. And it's working out how insurance coupled with a crisis responder or the help from a crisis responder can actually benefit a company. And then also there's that risk transfer available there. A lot of the insurance market and the underwriters we're transacting with are currently experiencing a softening. Terms and conditionings are broadening, which allows clients to experience very tailored programs to cover a very broad list of different perils, which is highly, highly important with the sort of ever-changing risk environment that we are currently seeing, whether it's ranging from hurricanes or wildfires all the way to the wars and emerging threats in the Middle East that Dale and Francis have just touched on as well.
The only thing that I will add, and Chris talked about my background of being in-house, actually in the corporate world. I was involved in, unfortunately, a number of significant incidents, but one of the largest that I was involved with, I actually and ran. I spent a lot of time with our treasurer. I spent a lot of time with our insurance people, and one of our responsibilities in the communications was being able to communicate with all of our stakeholders, our banks, and also our insurers. And because there was not there was property damage involving a significant number of people, even though a lot of it was not significant damage, but it did involve a large number of people. So claims went on for some period of time, and the communications, again, this is the external part of the communications. You have to keep all of those stakeholders in mind, including the insurers. And so obviously this is a different aspect of it than what Will was discussing, but we had to be very cognizant of what we were saying about the incident externally because of how that could be interpreted by our insurers and by everyone else, our customers, our banks. And so all of those aspects of communication involving a particular crisis have an effect, and your insurers can react accordingly.
Thank you. Let's talk about business continuity and operational stability. So a crisis occurs in the organization you're affiliated with. One of the biggest concerns is ensuring that the business goes on and that you're still providing a TSR for your shareholders. So what's the role of tabletop exercises, and how should the board be involved?
Well, I can jump in on that. Again, this goes back to preparation, and this applies to every company. You've got to be able to continue to run the business. It also is exactly why the board should not be actively involved, except in the situations that we've already stipulated, because it's the management team's responsibility to ensure that the business keeps running, and it's the management team's responsibility to designate the crisis response team. Now, depending on the company, that may not involve the CEO running the crisis response. In fact, in most companies, it shouldn't be the CEO, and that runs counter to a lot of people's thinking on this. The CEO is involved, but often, depending on the type of crisis that it is, there are other people that are better prepared to manage the actual response. It's the CEO's job to keep the board informed. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, it's the same situation I was mentioning before. Our head of operations and I were responsible every morning to provide a report and to brief our CEO on what was going on. This went on for 6 months. And we gave him a report every day, and it was his responsibility to make sure that the board was informed of any updates that needed to be provided. And it wasn't, as time went on, he wasn't providing daily updates to the board. But we had an entire team of people. We had a room designated, and we had a complete entire team of people, plus outside advisors that would come in and help. You need lots of arms and legs to keep something like that going while everybody else is running the company.
I appreciate that answer, Francis. One of the things I was engaged in with a board I serve on was we brought in outside experts. And I really found that very helpful as a board member to be educated before something occurred. And so, Dale, tell us, when are you engaged from a board perspective?
Yes, ma'am. So I'll dovetail off of what was just said and then give a little bit of a gritty execution, if you will. Number one, I agree. The board's role is to ask when and how the C-suite management team are preparing for crisis. When I say when and how, to your point, how many times do they review insurance? How many times do they review their vendor network to solve those big muscle movement threats that I described in the first place? If there has been an actual crisis in the last 5 to 10 years, the board should ask to review the utilization of their resiliency playbook and the outcomes And most importantly, they should ask for the lessons learned and then follow up and ask the management team, have you implemented the appropriate changes? So it really is governance and oversight in trying to force the management team to make sure they truly are prepared. They've addressed gaps between insurance and actual capability. And the other thing I would ask every board member I deal with is when you think about these resiliency playbooks, large companies bring in EY, Deloitte, Bain, whoever, McKinsey, whoever it might be, and they build 150 to 200, 300 page resiliency playbooks. When I walk into a board, I've briefed 7 boards in the last 9 weeks because of everything going on in the world. If I was a board member, I would simply ask, in the last 2 or 3 crises you might have, was the 200 to 300 page resiliency playbook actually used? Did the management team get it out, review it, and execute it, or not? What I would tell you is the gritty reality is it is worthy of the exercise of building those kinds of templates and playbooks. But the reality is if you cannot boil your 300 page document from Deloitte down to about 10 pages that says, here is the scenario, here is who you call, here are your assets, and this is the CFO's role, the COO's role, the COO's role, the HR director's role, the CISO's role. This is the team and where they sit and how we're going to execute. If you cannot take that very large complicated document and boil it down to about 10 PowerPoint slides, that is the gritty governance that you should be looking for as a board member to make sure that the management team is truly taking this serious. They are prepared and they are learning lessons after each crisis, so they are prepared.
Great. Will, would you add anything to that?
No, I guess the only element from the sort of risk transfer insurance side of things is going back to that risk mitigation allowance. A lot of them are giving you a 5 to 10% of premium to be used for this pre-incident training. And that's where the benefit of these tabletop exercises can become so important, because even though a board may know their crisis response plan inside out, they have a great crisis response team, it's bringing external help in. To Dale's point and Francis's point is to stress test what's already there, to actually work out what triggers are in place, what the protocols are, and what the communication teams are if any of these crises actually happen. It's just to reinforce that there are insurance policies and risk mitigation allowances that will actually help to aid clients for that pre-incident training, including tabletop exercises.
Just to build upon that, one of the things that I really like to say about tabletops is it builds the muscle memory. So it stress tests, how you react, but it builds the muscle memory. And the reason that that's important from my standpoint is this. I don't know how many of you have actually been the responder in those situations, but you may know the playbook, which, by the way, if I see a 300-page playbook, when clients come to us and ask us to review and update their playbook or whatever, the first thing I will tell them is they need to streamline it, because no one is going to look at that and that it will collect dust. Has to be actionable. And a 300-page playbook is not actionable because no one has time, and which goes to the point that I wanted to make about being in the actual crisis. As knowledgeable as anyone is, and as many times as they've practiced, and our tabletops were such that we weren't allowed to just play act. I mean, we had to act as if it was a real crisis. And the point is, you're in shock. I mean, you are in shock when it first happens. And so your muscle memory doesn't automatically kick in. So it's helpful to have something right in front of you, a checklist of exactly what Dale was describing. But then your muscle memory starts to kick in, and you just you know what to do immediately and you get it done. Because from the communication side and also the operational side, if you will, you have to react. And it is a protocol that you get your first communication out within the first hour of an incident. That's not a lot of time because you don't have a lot of information, and your first communication actually says that very thing. But you have to acknowledge what's going on.
I appreciated all of that preparedness. In my professional experience, I ran hospitals, and everybody had to know the details at any moment. Some of you from Houston might recall when the Texas Medical Center flooded. We had a hospital down there at Herman Hospital and had to evacuate the hospital. Everyone had to know exactly what role they played and what they were to do to ensure patients were safe, people were safe. In Austin, we had a shooting. It was about 4 years ago on 6th Street. 6 patients come running in with gunshot wounds, and the team had to know what's our emergency management plan. And they were able to execute it with precision, and you don't have time to pull out a 300-page document. You just will never have that kind of time. And so the preparedness and ensuring that your management team knows what actions need to happen and when. One of the things Francis said I will highlight, because I really, my experience with some of those, what we would call major events in the community, the communication had to be extremely clear to the media, because the media lines up everywhere and they're all trying to get a piece of the story. And so we had one person that would do our external communication in all of those situations. And that was the only person who talked to the media, because we didn't want anything misinterpreted or exaggerated. And we wanted to make certain that the community understood that we had complete control and management of the situation. And our overall goal was to ensure patient safety. So very important.
And I'll add, in addition to the one spokesperson, you need to have one designated attorney attached to that spokesperson's hip. And that's how you're able to gain the speed. And this is where the 80-20 rule comes in. And this is the hardest thing in the world for boards and also C-suites to deal with. In the early days of a crisis, everyone wants to approve the statements, and you cannot do that. That's why boards should not be interfering. It's why a good CEO will designate the crisis response team and let them go with it. And that's where you have to go with the 80% rule to get these statements out, but you have to have the attorney with them to make sure that the statements are not saying something that they shouldn't say.
Thank you. Okay, so I appreciate everyone's comments on the preparedness and can't stress that enough. And I think you've just heard from 3 experts. Let's make certain our management teams are prepared for this. But recovery. So the crisis happens and now you're in recovery mode and you're really focused on the reputation and the resilience of the team. What kind of long-term structural changes should the board consider post-recovery or in the recovery phase?
From a insurance risk transfer perspective, this isn't completely in our ballpark, but one thing I will say is everything we've mentioned before, it's hopefully having that risk transfer insurance policy in place, liaising with the crisis responders, having the crisis response plans in place, so then any mitigation or reduction of how large a claim scenario can go is mitigated and the insurance is there to respond as and when it can. And the worst thing that we often see is almost a head in the sand approach to certain perils being insured. And it's that might not happen to us, and therefore not actually showing an interest in that purchasing of insurance. But then post that potential crisis or that loss scenario is then looking to procure that insurance. And at that stage, the market or the capability of the market might have shifted, and then the premium spend could have basically quadrupled compared to what it could be before. So it's always being, once again, reviewing insurance policies and making sure that the adequate level of cover is in place. And hopefully it's not trying to insure something, as the saying goes, while it's on fire.
Ma'am, if I could.
Yes.
So a very different answer, very actionable answer, if you will, for the group. The traditional role of a board focused on value creation and the bottom line, where I do believe in the current world we live in, there has to be a pivot to acknowledge that geopolitics, geoeconomics, and cyber matter in a way they have never mattered in the past. And boards can no longer be as myopic to be just focused on value creation and the bottom line. If you truly want to protect a firm and protect its future and protect its future earnings, the acknowledgement that geopolitics, geoeconomics, and cyber matter and are only going to get more difficult and more complex as the world changes, my first comment is every year, those subject matter experts should come in at the end of a board meeting or a precursor to a board meeting and be part of the education of the board. The other highlight I'll make is your typical board members are, call it, mid to late 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80 years old. They did not grow up in the cyber world with the cyber challenges we now face. Last year, the world had $9 trillion with a T, $1 trillion in cyber losses. Boards are partially responsible for those losses because they did not educate themselves and they did not take the cyber threat seriously enough. Boards, I will tell you right now, today, are behind on geopolitics and geoeconomics materially. Now, they are trying to catch up quickly on geoeconomics, but they are behind. So my first key takeaway is that there should be an educational process for your 4 board meetings a year, where at 3 of them, those 3 topics are peppered in, even if it's just 15 minutes. It now matters. The second comment I will make is I cannot tell you, when I look at the composition of a management team briefing a board, many times, believe it or not, the HR director is not included, the chief security officer is not included, the chief information security officer is not included, the HR director is not included. Depending on the industry, depending on their makeup, either all of them or 1 or 2 of them will not be present. In my personal opinion, this is a massive mistake. Do not let the board meeting be so myopic, and do not let it be closed to having those subject matter experts in the room because of the current environment and where the world is going. Having those people having a seat at the table now matters.
Thank you. Dale, I'll share with you in running hospitals, we have residents. Many of the places I worked were all academic and teaching. And so you have a group of 700 residents there. And guess what? They never worked on paper and pencil. And so you had a little cyber attack, and these folks had no idea how to chart in a medical record because they were just used to the templates in the computers. And so we quickly put together a training session because there was a significant deficit there with folks that have just been trained on computer technology and really aren't used to that paper and pencil. Go ahead. It was just
Well, I'm going to give you 2 responses. One about building resilience and learning from an incident. The board needs to ask for a report with all of the subject matter experts involved. There should be a post-incident, post-crisis evaluation of what worked, what didn't work, where are the gaps, what do we need to do to improve our response, what did we miss? The more important part of that in terms of reputation, from my standpoint, there are definitely things that we as a firm can do to help build reputation post a crisis. I'm not going to get into that today because I don't think that's nearly as important as what I'm going to tell you. I'm all about crisis avoidance, which goes back to the preparation. But it also goes back to something that is very, very key in developing a crisis plan. And it's something that the board can not, again, guide, but influence. And that is, when I talk to clients, corporate clients, and boards, the most important part of a crisis plan, in my mind, are a set of guiding principles. What do you want, as a company, the outcome to be? How do you want it to reflect on your company? It should reflect the values of who you are and what you stand for. And the reason that this is so important, it goes back to when I said, if you talk to a group of executives at any one company, they're not all going to agree on the vulnerabilities. They also won't all agree on the guiding principles. And you need to work through that, obviously not when you're in a crisis, because those become the guiding principles that will tell you how you need to respond. And when you reach, because you're going to have to make some decisions. There are things that you really need to do within a crisis to preserve your reputation at the end. And it's going to involve choices. And I don't mean choices about, anything legal, illegal, things like that. But it will involve choices. And so I'm going to give you a few examples, and then I'm going to tell you a brief anecdote. And it's one of the most important things is do the right thing. Now, that doesn't sound very profound, but you need to think about that. Do the right thing. Be transparent. Now, there are some caveats to be transparent, which we can get into later or talk about after this. But it's, only share facts is part of the being transparent. Don't speculate, in other words. If you're in, companies that have this as a value, safety will be a guiding principle. The safety of the community, your employees, and those in the communities in which you operate. It's going to be different for every company, but it should reflect who you are, and it should guide how you work your way through. It doesn't need to be a long list. Usually it's 4 or 5. But it makes a difference, and I'm going to tell you how it makes a difference. So I've mentioned this one incident. It was a big incident, like a 300-foot fireball in the air. You don't ever want to see those, let me tell you. And interestingly enough, there were no fatalities, for which we were grateful, but there was one young man who was very seriously injured, and it was going to impact the rest of his life. And within that first hour, we'd gotten out a statement. We loaded up 2 company planes full of people and flew them from Texas to Pennsylvania. We had people all over the ground. And it was not our CEO who went. It was the president of that operating unit. In any event, people went to the hospital. We were taking care of that family and all of their family members. We held town halls. I and 15 members of my staff rotated through for 6 months in that area. The point of this, we had I don't even remember how many insurance claims, and some of it was like one window broken out, and some of it was some smoke damage to a house. You know, there were all sorts of things. Some of it was cars needed to be washed. The long and the short of this was and then ultimately what we did was we dug up, if any of you are in the energy industry, this will make sense to you. We dug up 400 miles of pipe to check all of that pipe. And this happened in April. We were trying to get it all done before the winter heating season because we had to have it back in the ground so we could serve the winter heating season, and to make sure that all of that pipe was safe. Of course, we had people evaluating what had happened, which, as it ended up, we knew what had happened, but there was no conclusive evidence indicating why it happened. There was a pretty good understanding of why it had happened, which had nothing to do with the company, but that didn't matter. So this was costly, and it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of manpower, and we're still running a company. And lawsuits, insurance claims, every one of them was settled within 1 year, including the young man who had been seriously injured. And his attorneys told our attorneys in court that in their entire collective years of practice, they had never, ever seen anything resolved that quickly. And they said, and the reason is you did the right thing. And I tell you that, it still gives me chills, but that's what made the difference. And we found out later, no one even told us about this, but we actually won some PR award, a top 5 PR award for one of the most perfectly executed crisis responses. And I say that only because it was reflective of our guiding principles.
Thank you, Frances. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So we have about 10 minutes for questions.
We develop tabletops for boards and also C-suites. I call them executive roundtables rather than tabletops. Tabletops to me are truly what Will described, and that's really going through an actual incident. What to me is very important with the C-suite, and with the C-suite, it's being able for those individuals to understand what their role is and how they would respond. And often it's also revisiting those guiding principles and some of the key aspects of what's important about how you will respond. Be transparent, various aspects, don't speculate. And the decision tree, in other words, you're not going to all get to review every press release that goes out, to remind them of this and make sure everybody, holds hand and sings Kumbaya to that. The board is even a level above that. It's to help them understand that there is a well-honed plan. And again, what the decision tree is, the guiding principles, just that they can understand. And also, often with boards, and this will usually be the request of the board chair or the CEO, to, at a high level, run through the various scenario plans.
Dale, did you want to add?
Yes, ma'am. I'll answer this even more direct. Boards should not be involved in tabletops. They should be involved in a discussion in an educational format, if you will. Tabletops should be executed by the management team for that tactical execution. Ultimately, the management team should be exercised for the tactical execution. The board should be educated, and they should be prepped with the right, hard, gritty questions to ask to guide the management team. That's my overarching answer and very direct answer. One other comment I'll make. If you're all familiar, I think Frances said it 3 times now, this concept of 80-20, And she actually said, I like to avoid things. I couldn't agree more with one caveat and just one slightly different optic on this. I would tell you the frequency of emergency, the frequency of natural disasters, terrorism, conflict, all of these things are increasing every year. The exposure is simply increasing. I do believe that the model of 80-20 in the world we live in is now wrong. I think the concept of 80% of preparation and avoidance versus 20% on execution and the after-action review of update of lessons learned no longer applies in the world we live in. I believe it has to be 50-50. You have to be 50% focused on your preparation and avoidance, but you need to spend an equal amount of time on how you're going to execute in crisis. The 80-20 model is now dated, in my opinion. I think it's old, and it applied to a model in corporate America 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Ultimately, to make my point, every event I'm about to list is something that is unavoidable because you cannot predict it with accuracy. The 2015 Paris attacks, over 500 people shot and killed. 2017 Puerto Rico Virgin Island hurricanes. 2020, the first pandemic of COVID in my lifetime. I don't think most of us ever thought we'd actually live through a pandemic. I now believe we will see another one before we die if you're less than 55 years old. The Russian-Ukrainian war, the invasion from Gaza into Israel, completely missed by Mossad and the CIA. The Maui fires. If I asked you, is Maui a great place in paradise? Has anything ever bad happened to Maui? 95% of us would say it's paradise. Nothing ever bad happens. Yet there's billions of dollars of losses and 100 people burnt to death. The Asheville hurricanes. No one saw it coming. No one could predict it. No analysis, no weather models could have seen it coming. The Los Angeles fires. 5 months ago, the terrorist attack in New Orleans. 5 months ago, the Germany Christmas market attacks. Not one of those events in the world I live in can actually be predicted or prepared for to be avoided. Therefore, the amount of time you spend on avoiding the crisis, you better have the equal amount of brain power and preparation on how you're going to execute through it. I think it is one of the biggest changes in corporate America. That 80-20 rule has got to be updated, and the board is the mechanism to reinforce that messaging.
I want to say I have failed as a communicator. And my apologies, Dale. When I was using the 80-20 rule, I meant 80% good or there in terms of like a press release, and 20% it probably could be better. Definitely not 80%, prepared and 20% execution.
Then I misspoke.
No, you didn't misspeak. I think you spoke perfectly. Yeah. I did not communicate that well. I would say you need to be 100% prepared and you need to 100% execute.
Great. Any other questions? Go ahead, Kathleen.
I'm happy to kick this off, and Will and Dale, I know actually you need those two. Yeah, is what I would say. You definitely need those two. I want them on my team. Again, to Kathleen's point, I consider that part of your preparation, because you need to know you've got the right people in your corner when you're not having a crisis. And that includes, making sure you've got the right insurance, making sure you've got the right advisors. Dale is in a league of his own in terms of the kind of work that they do. And if you're I'm going to let him speak for himself, but this is the guy that I would want advising me if I was in a global company. And, you need to have the right outside counsel. And then that may, that's going to be part of your regular counsel, depending on the kind of incident. If it's a harassment situation, you're going to need, employment counsel. You'll need different kinds of counsel. Where communications are concerned, or the kind of work that we do, which is, investor and, dealing with the media, we kind of cover that whole gamut. It can be multifaceted. You may be with a very large, sophisticated company that has a large team of people, and you may need, again, you still have to run the company, and depending on the situation, it can be a very confidential kind of situation where you need to keep the group very small that's under the tent. So you may need to have some outside advisors that can help you that have been through a lot of these situations. That's the other thing. Some situations, if you're in an energy company, unfortunately, lots of incidents happen. But it just depends. But you need to look into these things based on your vulnerabilities, and then get those people in your Rolodex, talk to people, know that they're there, and if you have an incident, you can call them.
Will and Dale, we have a few minutes left. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah. So as I've tried, I'm going to answer this in 5 bullets, if you will, of very actionable items. Number 1, we have Will here from insurance. They're my broker. I am listed as a master service provider on medical evacuation, kidnap and ransom, secure response, and cyber for the Fortune 1000. So I know what both sides do and what they're responsible for. My first rhetorical question to all of you in the audience is, when is the last time you actually read your insurance policy and focused on the restrictions? The restrictions that I would tell you to highlight and focus in on are in a terrorist attack, in a natural disaster, in a war zone. What are you covered for and what are you not? When you identify what you're not, you then have a choice. You can then see if there is specialty insurance, which Will is an expert in, to cover that. And if that's not available, then you have to have vendors who contractually will run to the terrorist attack, run to the natural disaster, and run to the war zone. That's the first element of finding those gaps. Number 2, if you have a cyber event, you better understand who's going to negotiate for you with the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and how you're going to pay that ransom if that is the decision. Is that going to be through Bitcoin? Is it going to be through the dark web, or is that going to actually be bags of money in the third world? It matters to ask that question. If you have a kidnap ransom scenario, again, a rhetorical question, has anyone in this audience ever sat with an actual negotiator for 30 minutes to an hour to understand the playbook and how it actually works and what's actually covered versus your perception of it in the movies? Because the movies and reality are very different things. Number 4 is security, understanding who is going to get your people out of Kabul, who is going to get your people out of New Orleans or Puerto Rico or Hawaii, understanding the mechanisms and who is on your Rolodex for that has real global reach and capability. And then lastly, do you truly understand your medical evacuation? If your C-suite member or CEO is injured or sick in a foreign country, are they actually flying home back to Dallas? Or are they going where the insurance or the medical evac platform wants them to go? And if you do want them flown to Dallas, what's that going to cost? All of that should be mapped. Your insurance, your medical evac, your kidnap and ransom, your security evacuation, and your cyber should be right down to the details. You know every element of those things. The only way that's going to do that is if you take out a highlighter, read the policy, find your gaps, and then fill them, simply put, with external resources.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dale. So we are out of time right now. Really appreciate your engagement and your attention, and to our panel.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, Francis, Dale, and Will. We really appreciate your time today, and thanks for joining us electronically.